Will South Africa's new BEE targets be dead in the water? Last week, the Employment and Labour Department published its new transformation goals. They empower the minister to set industry-specific transformation targets in the hopes that the companies with more than 50 employees will become more demographically representative of the country. But the legislation has been criticised for having targets that are premature and quotas that aren't in line with the Employment Equity Amendment Act. Let's discuss this further. We've got the Chief Executive of the Black Business Council, Kganki, Matabane, who joins us now from Centurion. A very good afternoon to you, Mr. Matabane, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Let's start perhaps with the concerns that have been raised by different sects around the new legislation and how the quotas will now be determined by the Department of Labour.
Good afternoon, Rufua and the viewers. Maybe let's start with the context of why the department came to this conclusion. And firstly, we do support the amendments, mainly because this year we are 29 years into democracy. We also, this year, is 25 years of the Employment Equity Act. And then this is the act that was meant to bring affirmative action to ensure that black people, women, coloreds are basically treated fairly in the workplace. They are employed, they are promoted, and then they are promoted to the senior level. But when we look at what is happening, the Employment Equity Commission on an annual basis released a report called a Employment Equity Report. And in that report, you'll see 29 years into democracy, 70% of the CEOs of JSE-listed companies are still white males. The next level of the senior executive is still the same. The hiring of people and the promotions of people also reflects that white males are promoted much quicker. They are brought into employment much quicker. And also white women are also overrepresented, including Indian women and men, they are overrepresented. So the colored males, colored women, African male, African females are underrepresented. So what this government is trying to do is they're trying to then say, how do we then solve this problem? Because what has happened, companies, instead of hiring black women or colored women or black men or colored men, instead they hire white women or they hired Indian women, and then they say we've achieved our targets. But when you look at the demographic representation, that a promotion of white women does not necessarily achieve that. It makes them to be overrepresented, but then the people who are supposed to be benefiting from this employment equity are not necessarily benefiting. So government is trying to find ways of saying, how do we then force these companies to meet their own targets? Because remember, these targets are not set by government. These targets are set by private sector companies, but they fail to meet them. So you will need to find a way of forcing them to implement equity. Otherwise, 50 years from now, or even 100 years from now, we'll be sitting where we're sitting.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that, Mr. Matabane, because I was thinking we have struggled over the years to enforce or have oversight on existing legislation when it comes to transformation and inclusion in corporate South Africa. With the Department of Labour taking on this role, do you think that this will actually be better if the department struggled to make sure that companies were adhering to the different targets that were set for them previously? How confident are you that this would actually change the tide?
Yes, I think if it's legislation, we need it to be there so that if companies are not implementing the Employment Equity Act, we as a Black Business Council and other organizations similar to us can actually take those companies to courts for failure to comply with the legislation. But to be honest with you, we're not confident that the department will all of a sudden have capacity to monitor, because the biggest challenge that we're having in South Africa is that we do have legislations that, if at least 50% of those legislations were implemented properly, we will be in a much, much better position. But government does not have, or does not make, because we can't say they don't have, they don't make enough efforts to make sure that they've got enough capacity to implement this legislation. Because for us, government should be going to these companies and just walk around and see, because most of these companies that claim that they are transformed, you walk into them, you don't see a level 1 company. You walk into them, you realize that the only black people who are there are the drivers and the cleaners. All the management are white males mainly, and they're allowed to do that thing because government is not implementing and monitoring what is supposed to be implemented. But we still support the legislation, because once the legislation is there, we will be able to take those companies to court ourselves for failure to implement a government legislation.
And at the same time, Mr. Matabane, it's going to be a fine balancing act, if you'll agree with me here, that while we enforce these issues of transformation in corporate South Africa, we cannot compromise competency at the expense of filling a company with people of color. How do companies and the Department of Labor all work together to make sure that that balancing act is realized?
Yeah, we fully agree with you. Appointing black people or appointing women does not mean you are compromising quality. If you look at the people who are CEOs now, and people who are senior executives, they started employment, most of them, after 1994, which means a lot of black people started working and started being given opportunities also since 1994. So there are a lot of black people who've got serious, solid experience out there, but they're just not being given an opportunity to go to the top. And that is our issue. Remember, the economy was run by less than 10% of the population pre-1994. And in 1994, the workplace was open to all of us. So almost 90% of the people who are in South Africa now do have the capacity and skills to be able to run these companies. So the issue of skills is neither here nor there. It's being used by people who don't want to give black people an opportunity to run these companies.
And then, Mr. Matabane, what about the argument, finally, if you will, that this legislature could be something that deters investment of other multinationals coming into South Africa for fear that these unrealistic, and I put that in inverted commas, quotas are going to be imposed on them by government? Does that concern you at all, the deterrent of investment that could potentially come as a result of this? Or are these just concerns that are just being bandied about and don't have any substance?
Yes, those excuses don't have any substance, because if you go to other countries, you go to Singapore, you go to China, even in the continent, you go to Kenya, you go to Rwanda, majority of the CEOs that are there would be indigenous people from there. Majority of the company of the CEOs in China would be Chinese. Singapore would be the same. Kenya would be the same. Nigeria would be the same. That cannot only apply what is South Africa. So you can see that is just merely an excuse not to give South Africans an opportunity. And then remember, in South Africa, what we're trying to do, as opposed to Europe and the US, we're trying to empower the majority. We're not empowering the minority. And the challenge is that if you don't empower the majority as quickly as possible, we're also threatening the very same democracy that we have, because one day the majority are going to then decide to say, let's render this country ungovernable because we are excluded in opportunities in our own country. So what we're trying to say was saying this is not only a political imperative, it's also a business imperative. It's a democratic imperative. You cannot continue to exclude the majority. That is not sustainable.
No, thank you very much for those insights and for joining us this Sunday afternoon. That is the CEO of the Black Business Council, Mr. Kganki Matabane, this afternoon, speaking on those changes around transformation in corporate South Africa.